quick note that we are recording and that the recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. Over to you.
Okay, welcome everybody to the final session today. We've had some wonderful presentations and some wonderful discussions in our question times. Very interesting. So we'll move on to the first presentation in this session by Hazal Özdemir. I hope I pronounced that correctly. The presentation, Undesirable Subjects in and Out of the Empire, Mobility, Nationality, and Making of an Ottoman Subject. Now, Hazal is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Northwestern University, Illinois. She's currently writing her dissertation, which explores Armenian circular mobility between the Ottoman Empire and the United States between 1896 and 1908. Her project contributes to the existing literature on Ottoman Armenian history and studies on Ottoman nationality by focusing on the methods devised to regulate the mobility of undesirable subjects, such as denaturalization, bureaucratic forms of violence, and photo registers. Before coming to Northwestern, Hazal received a Bachelor of Arts in History from Boğaziçi University, Turkey, and a Master of Arts in the History of Art with Photography from Birkbeck University of London. Take it away.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction, and I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Today I will present a condensed version of two of my dissertation chapters, and this is a work in progress, so I would really love to hear your comments and suggestions. I will try to share my screen. But let's see if I can do it. Why is it not working? Yes. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
I made a little change in the presentation title. Undesirable subjects in and out of the empire, mobility, nationality, and unmaking of an Ottoman subject. In 1896, the government of Abdülhamid II began to encourage Armenians who were leaving for the United States to emigrate under the condition that they were denaturalized, terk-i tabiyet, and sign documents attesting that they would never return. Taking the denaturalization of Armenian transatlantic migrants as its primary case study, this paper scrutinizes Ottoman subjects unmaking. The effort to decide who could not be an Ottoman by centralizing its emigration and immigration policies came up during an era of turmoil. On the one hand, there was an ongoing effort to modernize and bureaucratize the Ottoman state apparatus, its ministries and offices. On the other hand, the empire was shrinking, and there was the need to reorganize the population, while the non-Muslims of the empire was decreasing. Security concerns, economic limitations, land disputes, and demographic aspirations contributed to the government of Abdülhamid II's nationality policies. I hold that Ottoman subjects unmaking included extraction and expulsion. Building on Armenian exclusion, I will open up the question of violence to investigate how the Ottoman government utilized administrative and legal tools to set boundaries for Ottoman nationality in a crucial stage of emptying of Ottoman landscape for Armenians. I will start with a little background. Armenian transcontinental mobility coincided with the age of high imperialism, which involved technological innovations such as steamships and trains, faster and more efficient connections between places, the emergence of interstate conflicts about the new regulation and surveillance systems such as quarantines, checkpoints, and passports, and time and space comparison. The industrial boom in North America created the demand for cheap labor and pushed transcontinental traffic. Although transatlantic mobility was mostly circular, the emphasis on the terminology of emigrant and immigrant is an outcome of unidirectional understanding and its highlight status. Quite the contrary, Italians, Greeks, Czechs, Sephardic Jews, Lebanese and Syrian Christians, and Armenians moved and relocated frequently. That's why I use the word migrant, and mobility instead of emigration, immigrant, so on. The transatlantic mobility of Armenians was linked to the seasonal migration of Armenians going to larger trading centers of the empire since the 17th century. They worked as artisans, porters, and firefighters in Istanbul. The increasing involvement of the Ottoman Empire in the globalizing world economy in the 19th century brought about an economic crisis in the interior regions, such as the 6 eastern provinces or the Armenian plateau. The eastern provinces did not have an access to seacoasts and therefore outside markets, lacked the means to export its agricultural and manufactured goods as port cities did. The depressed regional economy, when combined with the influx of Caucasian refugees, land disputes, and increasing conflicts with Kurdish tribal leaders, pushed migration. The situation at home got worse after the disastrous defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the hands of Russia in 1878 and the following Berlin Treaty, which maintained Ottoman sovereignty in the Armenian provinces on the condition of reforms to protect Armenians and submit periodic reports about these reforms to great powers. The Ottoman government considered reform an insult to its sovereignty and a threat to the territorial integrity of the empire, fearing that European supervised reforms would pave the way for Armenian independence. As the circumstances of Armenian peasants deteriorated and reform demands remained unfulfilled, a group of Armenians began to regard armed resistance against the Hamidian regime as the only option, such as the Social Democratic Hınçak Party and the Armenian Revolutionary Federation. Facing the intransigence of his Armenian subjects and the growing interference of the great powers on their behalf, Abdülhamit II took advantage of long-lasting disputes over land. The establishment of the Hamidian regiments in 1891, which was a paramilitary corps formed mainly by Kurds and Caucasian refugees, was seen as a local solution to punish and uproot Armenians. After a series of anti-Armenian massacres between 1894 and 96, 28 Daşnak Sütun members stormed the Ottoman Bank in Istanbul in August 1896. As an Ottoman-British-French joint venture, the Ottoman Bank was a symbol of foreign presence in the empire, and its seizure could bring the intervention of the great powers. Even though the attack was taken under control very quickly, Muslim crowds killed almost 6,000 Armenians, the main target being the laborers who came to work in Istanbul. The beginning and the end of the attacks were synchronized all over the city, and the same type of batons was used against disarmed Armenians, suggesting that the massacre was planned. After this massacre, the police sent Armenian laborers immediately to their homes. The Interior Ministry noted that almost 16,000 Armenians came to Istanbul before this event, and 4,000, which was associated with the seizure of the Ottoman Bank, were sent home. The remaining Armenians who came to Istanbul to work had to be sent gradually to their villages because Armenians were no longer allowed to come back to the capital. İlkay Yılmaz situates the Istanbul ban on Armenians and the desire to regulate Armenian internal mobility within the framework of the Ottoman government's security policies. She argues that by regulating Armenians' migration, the Hamidian government not only created the administrative infrastructure of security, but also new methods of criminalization. In October 1896, the government finally issued a decree that required Armenians who wanted to leave to renounce their Ottoman nationality, submit a document attesting that they would never return. The responsibilities of the Teşri Muamelat Commission, which was a sub-department in the Interior Ministry and responsible for making reforms in Ottoman Armenia, was extended to include monitoring Armenian mobility. And another sub-commission under the Teşri Muamelat was formed to investigate why Armenians were going abroad and regulate this transatlantic flow and the travel documents of Armenians. Although the Office of Nationality was under the Foreign Ministry, this commission under the Interior Ministry would oversee the cases of Armenian migrants, which became an internal threat to the imperial security. The meaning of the Tarki Tabiyet rule becomes clearer in a historical trajectory that began in 1869, when the Ottoman nationality law was passed. The Hamidian government was monitoring Armenians' denaturalization at the end of the 19th century according to this law, which argued that the Ottoman government could deny return and subject it to the person who, without imperial authorization, changes nationality or enters the military service of a foreign state. Ottoman subjects were not allowed to change their subject status without the permission of the state. If they did so, they still would be considered Ottoman subjects. Denaturalization still happens the same way in Turkey. The state could denaturalize you, but you can't denaturalize yourself. The final article argued that each person living in the Ottoman domains would be regarded as an Ottoman, and anyone who claimed to be a foreigner had to provide evidence. Since the works on Ottoman nationality have been mostly done by political scientists, the meaning and connotation of the term tabiyet and the social roots of the nationality law were overlooked. Tabiyet could be translated as subjecthood, nationality, or allegiance. Some historians use the term citizenship, or at least use nationality and citizenship interchangeably, which I think is not very accurate. Historians such as Will Henley, on the other hand, argue that citizenship is the wrong word to use because citizens are full members of the society whose positions are secure, while the Ottoman subjecthood law mainly concerned children and wives of foreigners, orphans, emigrants, and immigrants whose positions are the most insecure. So 1869 law did not aspire to create a citizenry and political belonging, but created a form of legal affiliation and aimed to define the rights and protections of subjects. Rather than seeing the nationality code as a culmination of previous centralizing reforms, we can associate it with the history of foreign interference in the Ottoman Empire. In 1779, after the loss of the Crimean Khanate, the Küçük Kaynarca Agreement forced the Ottoman state to give the Russian imperial government the right to establish an Orthodox church in the imperial capital, in addition to the right to protect Orthodox Christian subjects. Russia would employ these capitulations as a pretext for their interventions in the Balkans. Britain and France also stepped in a number of times, forced the Ottoman state to grant capitulations to their nationals residing in the empire. The Paris Treaty of 1856 formalized and further entrenched capitulatory agreements granting European subjects and proteges extraterritorial rights and privileges, such as immunities from Ottoman law and taxation, which undermined the legal authority of the Ottoman state. The protege law of 1863 stated that protection would no longer be extended to family members or could be inherited, and Ottoman subjects could not be proteges easily. Once protection had become difficult, Ottoman subjects turned toward naturalization, and this prepared the environment for the promulgation of the 1869 nationality law. Nevertheless, I argue that although preventing extraterritoriality and European foreign privilege was related to the policies of Ottoman subjects naturalizing as European citizens, it is not a suitable lens for analyzing Ottoman attitudes towards Armenian transatlantic mobility. Extraterritorial rights and privileges were granted to those who could demonstrate a firm formal bond connecting them to a foreign state, either as a protege, subject, or citizen, and they should demonstrate evidence to the Office of Nationality, which translated as Tabiyet Kalemi. Tabiyet Kalemi was an office built under the Foreign Ministry, and its responsibility was to examine the validity of the claims of people who declared themselves as foreigners and proteges who resided within the Ottoman Empire. Intriguingly, the activities of this bureau didn't get significant academic attention, although it was only mentioned in a few articles concerning foreign ministry and only within the framework of institutionalization and bureaucratization of the Foreign Office. In 1888, the office was disparaged when the director Asım Bey and his Istanbulite partner in crime Avram Bey, who declared himself to be a part of the Italian consulate of Istanbul, denaturalized almost 600 Jews from Salonika. Apparently, those two friends were going to Salonika every now and then and denaturalizing Jews in return for 200 or 300 liras. It should be kept in mind that denaturalization happened only through the state apparatus in the Ottoman Empire. If Jews of Salonika were naturalized without the permission of the state, they would be still treated as Ottoman subjects. Nevertheless, these little trips to Salonika brought the end of the time of Asım Bey in the office. The Tabiyet Kalemi let people who quit the Ottoman Empire or preparing to quit to denaturalize if they wanted to leave abroad. They have to sell all their properties in the Ottoman Empire and cut all their ties. If they wanted to continue living within the Ottoman domains, the government would not authorize their denaturalization, since they would be exempt from military service and taxation, could rely on their consular officials to intervene on their behalf and protect them, and would be under the jurisdiction of consular courts. For example, an Armenian, John Torbajian, who was working at the French post office in Izmir, declared that he wanted to become a French citizen. The Aydın governor contacted the foreign ministry and asked about his situation. The director of the Tabiyet Kalem, the infamous Asım Bey, could not be sure, since Torbajian did not cut all his ties with the empire, means he still continues to live within the empire. So they asked the Office of Legal Counsel for their opinion. The Office of Legal Counsel, Hukuk Müşavirliği İstişare Odası, was another department under the foreign ministry, and its responsibility was to manage questions related to international law. They argued that since the Ottoman government recognized foreign post offices as part of their state apparatuses, Torbajian did not have to renounce his Ottoman subject to get a promotion. His request was declined. Another reason for the denial of imperial authorization to denaturalize was being indebted to the government. For example, Rodolfo Herzved, an Ottoman from the Aydın province, had recently naturalized as a French citizen, demanding his denaturalization. Foreign Minister Tevfik Pasha told the French consulate that he had to pay 575 kuruş debt to the government. When Mihran Kemhajian declared that he had been living in Paris for a long time, and it will be appropriate for him to apply for French citizenship, the foreign ministry realized that Kemhajian was a doctor who was educated in medical school in Istanbul and was sent to Paris for advanced study. Although he had to return to the Ottoman Empire to work, Kemhajian chose to stay in Paris without authorization. After their contact with the medical school, the foreign ministry decided to decline Kemhajian's request, since he did not pay his imperial duty. And we should keep in mind that at the end of the 19th century, lots of states avoided dual citizenship, and because they thought that you can only serve in the army of a state. So this created the tensions between the great powers and the Ottoman Empire. While people who then denaturalized and became great power citizens did face obstacles of many sorts, those obstacles were largely linked to the imperative to avoid dual state belonging and to ensure that they had fulfilled their obligations to one state. On the other hand, Armenians who wanted to denaturalize faced a much steeper set of expectations, as their denaturalization was linked to their erasure. Due to the differences in policies about subjects who were migrating to Europe and Armenians leaving for the US, I regard the policies of Abdülhamit II towards Armenian transatlantic mobility as demographic engineering. Demographic engineering could be defined as state policies that aim to shift the ethno-religious balance and composition of the empire, transforming and managing its population in accordance with the preferences of the government. Uğur Ümit İngör defines demographic engineering as encompassing the exercise of possible state policies aimed at changing the composition of a society. Donald Bloxham uses demographic engineering and population policies interchangeably as a series of coercive state measures in pursuit of reaching a homogeneous population. Demographic engineering involves forced assimilation, deportation, or putting economic and political pressures on certain communities that eventually force them to leave the country. Armenian labor migration didn't start as deportation or an exile, but the denaturalization requirement and the ban on return changed the nature of their mobility. Exclusionary laws in the home country rendered Armenians stateless, as they had to wait 5 years to acquire American citizenship after they renounced their subjecthood. Scrutinizing the division of labor, the decision-making processes, and the continuous communication and record-keeping between central and provincial officials who regulated the mobility of Armenians demonstrate that this empire-wide network required ordinary officials who worked in synchronization and collaboration, a bureaucratic establishment, lots of patience, and strong motivations. Creating a bureaucratic apparatus for monitoring and policing the transatlantic mobility of Armenians who had become undesirable subjects was a crucial phase of state-sanctioned violence. To designate the state, I employed the term bureaucratic violence. Bureaucratic violence is administered through processes of decision-making, paperwork, knowledge production, discrimination, and exclusion. Here, this concept refers to how the Hamidian government gathered and produced knowledge to target one ethno-religious community and normalize their discrimination. As the work of historians on Greater Syrian migration has shown, the Hamidian administration encouraged Syrian, Palestinian, and Lebanese migrants to keep their Ottoman subjecthood and return to the empire. Hence, this apparatus was built for Armenians only. The same officials who tolerated the hypermobility of Arab Christians linked the harsh cautionary bureaucratic measures on Armenians with the belief that they would bring fasad, sedition, such as autonomy, upon return. The Ottoman ambassador in Washington, D.C., Alexander Mavroyani Bey, reported Armenian activities and claimed that some Armenians would initiate armed resistance since they were migrating with the sole purpose of combat training, and they built headquarters in Ottoman Armenia to spread revolution. After learning how to use dynamite and torpedoes, they would attempt assassinations. Although there were probably a handful of revolutionaries among migrants who left for the US, the state exiled and imprisoned ordinary Armenians who tried to return to their home. For example, the governor of Mamouretulaziz wrote a letter to the Interior Ministry and asked what to do with Ohannes, his uncle Sirop, and their friend Sarkis, who also migrated to the US, worked in factories there for a couple of years, and returned to their home. The governor knew that Fasad people who escaped should not be allowed in the empire and must be returned immediately. However, he was confused about the cases of laborers who migrated to the US, not to create fasad, but for necessity, with the sole purpose of making a living. The minister dismissed the governor's desire to differentiate mobilities. Armenians who went to the US, no matter why they migrated, would be treated as it was decided in October 1896. Those who returned would not be accepted, and if they tried to return, they would be sent back immediately. The government therefore singled out Armenian transatlantic mobility as peculiar, suspicious, and dangerous. Ottoman state's differentiation between mobilities of diverse ethno-religious groups established a distinction between its subjects, those who could move freely with the state permission and Armenians who were prohibited from returning. Apparently, Armenian organizations were not the only source of sedition. In 1905, Teshi Muamelat Commission wrote a letter to the police ministry about a certain Simon Papazian, who was a Protestant preacher in Samsun. Papazian requested permission from the Interior Ministry to travel to North America with his wife and his daughter for a short time. The purpose of this trip was to marry Papazian's daughter to her fiancé, who was currently living in the US. The Interior Ministry declined the request of Papazian and allowed him to go to North America only if he renounced his subjecthood. Surprised by this decision, Papazian stated that he did not commit any crime and expressed his lifelong loyalty to the Ottoman state. When he communicated his desire to preserve his Ottoman nationality and return to his home, the Interior Ministry assigned the chief of his sanjak to investigate Papazian and his family. This research disclosed nothing negative about Papazian. What made him suspicious was his conversion to Protestantism. He studied at the Marzifon Protestant College, lived in America for a couple of years, and served as a preacher in the Protestant church. Suspecting his insistence on going to America, the local governor and the Interior Ministry stated that if he wanted to go, he had to denaturalize. Papazian's case is just an example of the ambiguities raised around Catholic and Protestant Armenians due to their links with European and American missionaries and their involvement in missionary schools opened in the Ottoman East. The local governors could not decide if these communities should be treated equally with Gregorian Armenians. In 1906, when the Bitlis governor asked if denaturalization was valid for all Armenian migrants, the Interior Ministry said Gregorians, Catholics, and Protestants all had to be denaturalized. To conclude, you may ask, if many people were denaturalized, who could be Ottomans? The process of erasing Armenians complemented registering new subjects, and we can delve deeper into this in the Q&A if you're interested. This paper examined the denaturalization of Armenian migrants leaving for the United States within diverse cases of nationality in the late Ottoman Empire. It argued that while the Ottoman attitudes towards non-Muslims migrating to Europe were linked more with extraterritoriality and Ottoman fears of foreign intervention, Armenian transcontinental mobility held a different place within the government, which was linked to imperial internal security and the demographic engineering process. Armenian denaturalization was a crucial step in the transition from the empire to the nation state, and this ethno-religious discrimination profoundly shaped Ottoman nationality and later Turkish citizenship. I see Turkey Tabiyet as the beginning of more standardized border building and mobility policing projects, such as the Greek-Turkish population exchange of 1923. Many thanks for listening to me. I'm waiting for your questions.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Am I
Okay.
still sharing this? Okay.
Yes, you'll have to there. Okay, great. Thank you. Alrighty, so up next we have İlkay Yılmaz with the presentation Mass Violence and Security Narrative During the Late Ottoman Empire, 1894 to 1907. İlkay is currently a Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft funded research associate at Friedrich Meinecke Institute, Department of Modern History at Free University Berlin. Her research interests focus on the history of security, passport history, inter-imperial collaboration on policing, state formation, and history of violence in the late Ottoman Empire. Her articles have appeared in the Journal of Historical Sociology, Middle Eastern Studies, Journal of Ottoman and Turkish Studies, and the Photo Researcher Journal of European Society for History of Photography. Her book, Ottoman Passports, Security and Mobility, 1876 to 1908, will be published by Syracuse University Press in September 2023. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. So I'll try to present my ongoing work. I'm still in the middle of the research actually, so it would be great to take your questions and also comments. So can I share my, okay, can you see it?
Yes, if you play your slideshow, it should be perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, now here it is. My research agenda, so it's actually a 3 years project, and my project is dealing with the history of security. I'm trying to understand the relation between the security policies and long-term violence in the Ottoman Eastern provinces. So long-term physical and structural violence through the administrative history of the Eastern Anatolia. And I'm also trying to understand the security mentality of Ottoman and later on the Turkish state elites and the interrelationality of security with regard to trans-imperial history approach. So I'm also trying to understand the interplay between the European colonialism and also the Ottoman internal colonialism. So I'm looking at the politics of internal borders, political geography, population, and territoriality. But I'm also trying to understand the discourse production, the narrative production on some certain historical events. Before that, I worked on Ottoman passports. So my book considers the history of two political issues, namely the Armenian and Macedonian questions, and investigates how the Hamidian government, the Ottoman government or the Ottoman Sultan between 1876 to the Young Turk Revolution, 1908, how the Ottoman government tried to improve the capacity of the state to create knowledge of the Ottoman population and to implement political decisions throughout the realm with its administrative infrastructure. So I analyzed two questions, the Armenian and the Macedonian question together, and it allows me to draw on both history of mobility restrictions and state control So these included regulations on passports, internal travel permit systems, hotel registrations, and so on, within the context of a fast expanding Ottoman police state. And I tried to provide a global institutional history of mobility restrictions on state documentation, analyzing travel regulations and other security practices within the context of a tumultuous late Ottoman political climate. And also I tried to understand the collaboration between the Ottoman government and the joint European security efforts to form an inter-imperial criminal justice network especially against anarchism. So this book investigates not a specific region, but a certain set of practices. But now my ongoing research, I'm focusing on one region, quote unquote, the Eastern provinces. And I'm trying to discuss or open a discussion on the political and structural effects of the Armenian question to the Ottoman state formation with using the Ottoman, British, and American archival sources and benefiting the emerging scholarship on the history of violence on Armenian question. To do so, I'm trying to employ the concepts and discussions of the critical security studies. So these are the photographs of the region. So the security studies, although the critical security studies focus on the macro security politics in the international system after the Cold War, I use the conceptual discussion to historicize the securitization of the Armenian question and broaden the historical analysis of the critical security studies. So security studies have so far mainly focused on Western experiences and therefore provide little insight into non-Western insecurities and offer little discussion of the state actors, agents, subjects, and objects of security from a global perspective. This was because the security studies generally focus on international relations, which have traditionally been defined by a realist approach to larger power struggles and a Eurocentric conception of world politics. Thanks to changes in the international system, security studies have also begun to change in the last 2 decades. And as part of this new area of research, the connection between security, state theory, citizenship, and governance has come under investigation. For a long time, security studies lacked proper historicization as well, and only recently have scholars embarked upon a discussion of historical actors, threat perceptions, security interests, and other issues. So the process of securitization of the Armenian issue or Armenian question, in conjunction with the process of state building in the means of modern state. Although the scholars of political history mainly analyze the Armenian question as internationalization of the Armenian question with referring to the European diplomatic involvement to the issue, the core of the problem for the Armenian community was the socioeconomic and interethnic relations that created the oppression of Armenian people and violence towards the Armenian people in the eastern provinces from 1860s on, from maybe 1840s on. So the violence towards the Armenian community as a problem existed before the internationalization of it, of the Armenian question. And the Armenian National Assembly actually sent 2 reports about the oppression in the provinces before 1878, before the Berlin Treaty. But it was the internationalization, or, it was after the Armenian question became a diplomatic matter that put its mark on the Ottoman domestic policies. The turning point was the Berlin Treaty, which was one of the most important 3 treaties. Those treaties were part of the treaty system after the Congress of Vienna in 1815 to protect the status quo of the international system. It was the response of the great powers towards the Russian expansion of the Ottoman territories, and the main aim of the treaty was to balance the Russian sphere of influence to protect, quote unquote, the European balance of power. Internationally, the identified security problem was the Russian gains after the Russia-Ottoman War and the increased Russian influence in the Balkans, while the possible disintegration of Ottoman Empire was considered as a risk for the security of Europe. The protection of the Ottoman Christians by the great powers stayed as an important issue, which was considered as a legacy of Paris Treaty in 1856. So the article of the Article 61 of the Berlin Treaty. Actually, it was the restored article of the San Stefano Treaty after the Ottoman-Russian War. It added an authority of superintending of the promised reforms in the eastern provinces to the great powers. So actually, it says that the Sublime Porte undertakes to carry out without further delay improvements and reforms demanded by local requirements in the provinces inhabited by the Armenians, and to guarantee their security against the Circassians and Kurds. It will periodically make known the steps taken to this effect to the powers who will superintend their application. So, according to the Ottoman Empire or the Ottoman government, quote, until San Stefano, the Armenian question was not heard of, end quote. Ottoman government framed the Armenian question as a problem, identifying it as an issue of foreign policy, placing the Armenian question as one of the critical problems about the territorial integrity of the empire and another layer of European and Russian imposed derogation of its sovereignty as a repercussion of the Berlin Treaty. So the European imperialist expansion during the 19th century in Levant and the creation of the small independent states in the Balkans came at the expense of the Ottoman lands, two of which were the main references of the Ottoman security memory, as I call, generated the historicity of the securitization of the Armenian question. So Greek independence, intervention to Lebanon, French invasion in Algeria, uprisings in Crete and Bosnia, bankruptcy of the empire, the Bulgarian uprising, and the foundation of the public debt administration by great powers of Europe, and then later the British occupation of Egypt, all of which led European interventions and European mixed commissions as supervisors, were the Achilles heels of the Ottoman sovereignty and kept active the Ottoman security memory as one of the main pillars of Ottoman policymaking in the trans-imperial arena, but also, for its domestic policymaking as well. So, as an anomalous member of this international system, Ottoman government was constantly searching new ways to limit the derogation of its sovereignty. Besides the real politics in the ground, the European view of Ottoman Empire and its bureaucrats as quote-unquote backward, underdeveloped, oppressive, and in some cases barbarian, was another dimension which had to be analyzed within the sovereignty problems. So the Ottoman diplomats, when you look at their reports to the foreign ministry or to the government, to the prime minister Sadaret, the Ottoman diplomats were responsible for justifying the Ottoman policies and actions, including the violence. And actually, the most striking case or the most striking reports were about the British Orientalism, which was mostly written in the Ottoman reports as the British hatred towards Islam and Turks played a part in Ottoman conceptualization for the securitization of the Armenian question. Actually, this became an important problem for the Ottoman diplomacy, especially after the effects of the Gladstone's pamphlet, quote-unquote, The Bulgarian Horrors and the Question of the East in 1876. So this pamphlet was a turning point for establishing the sympathy of European public opinion for the Bulgarian cause, and the midterm effect of these public opinion in Great Britain was the refusal of Ottoman demand for British military support during the Ottoman-Russian War. So this history of events then generated a new formulation for the diplomatic work of the Ottoman Foreign Office. So for the Ottoman high-level bureaucrats, the possibility of the autonomy of the Armenian community as a result of an international intervention to the eastern provinces accelerated their anxiety on establishing a security narrative, which was historically constructed through the Ottoman security memory that evolved in time. So defining the Armenian question primarily as a foreign policy issue had direct effects on the internal political decisions about it. So this security narrative was also institutionalized with the discourse production of the bureaucracy that led the change of understanding the problem, not only in the level of the state center, but also in the local level. So furthermore, the use of the security language created a new narrative about the Armenian question, which was not about the security of the Armenian people, which was actually the main problem, right? But the security of the state against the Armenian revolutionaries. And of course, defining the revolutionaries, I mean, it was so arbitrary. There were so many arbitrary definitions, and those definitions also used to criminalize the whole Armenian community. So it's also striking that in the Ottoman diplomatic correspondence, the Russian threat was articulated with the Armenian revolutionary threat. The political articulation of the Armenian question was evident in the narrative construction based on the association of domestic and international threats. On the one hand, the Ottoman government defined the Armenian question strictly as a domestic security problem in the reports or diplomatic correspondences targeting the foreign audience. On the other hand, the Armenian question was seen as a continuity of the history of European imperialist interventions to the Ottoman land in the internal correspondence of high-level bureaucracy and in the Ottoman internal reports. So the production of state reports about the Armenian question was mostly prepared under these two directions. However, it was not only the possibility of a foreign intervention that served to the securitization of the Armenian question, but the domestic state actors also targeted the eastern provinces to reform the political orders, and actually they saw an opportunity for a new process of quote-unquote modern state building as part of the long Tanzimat or modernization reforms. So while specific domestic and international threats were used for political justifications of interventions, and some of those interventions were actually military interventions as part of the securitization, they're also inherent part of the state building process with the actions of domestic political actors. So security narrative was constructed simultaneously with new functions and responsibilities of the units in the administrative structure, and this was part of the reshaping the political orders. Furthermore, these changes generated the everyday production of security narrative with actually every single administrative practice in the region. And securitization process serves to generate the diversified ways of knowledge production on the issues of internal and external threats. So securitization of the Armenian question is a perfect case study to point out the securitization process. I mean, securitization as a process, which composed of institutional and policy routines, expert knowledge, administrative strategies, and technocratic practices. Yeah. So the definition process of a security issue come along with information gathering, which was conducted through the use of various tools, including intelligence. The different administrative units had different functions and practices in the means of knowledge production through intelligence, and intelligence reports were both domestic and international. The methods of the Ottoman government were using to form the intelligence gathering, were reporting the news and opinion pieces in the foreign newspapers, including the revolutionary press, using agents to monitor the meetings of political suspects or revolutionary organizations, writing formal reports on actors or groups or organizations, and active work on foreign public opinion. So the last two had two sides, actually. These formal reports were written also to influence the foreign governments. And, the second, the active work on foreign public opinion was used to manipulate the foreign public opinion. So diplomacy is an active work that did not only involve the everyday diplomatic work in the means of defending the interests of the Ottoman Empire, but also a work based on active information gathering with routinized observations on foreign newspapers, foreign parliamentary discussions, private meetings of some specific political groups, and clandestine espionage, which can all be classified as intelligence gathering. So the Ottoman Foreign Ministry, actually, it was founded under the Sublime Porte in 1835, and its priority or its first most important task was to compete with the great powers to protect its sovereignty, the empire's sovereignty. So to achieve this aim of preserving its political control on its territories, Ottoman Empire established a regular exchange and distribution of information between different Ottoman consulates, the Ottoman State Center, different provinces, and also the military. Regarding the Armenian question, the institutional policy routines of the Ottoman diplomatic missions were directly tied to the administrative strategies and technocratic practices of this sort. So this network between the Sublime Porte, Ottoman embassies, and provinces gave the Ottoman Empire to create political strategies through the interpretations of domestic events with international developments. This tendency in policymaking also resulted in securitization of domestic political problems as well. So the network between state center, provinces, and embassies also illustrates the Ottoman security apparatus from domestic to international level. The Ottoman consulates were mapping not only the I always forget about the PowerPoint. So the Ottoman consulates were mapping not only the state actors of the foreign countries in the international relations, but they were also mapping different actors in a larger political context, like missionaries, church associations, journalists, revolutionary groups, politicians, etc. So who would defend or who would affect the public opinion with different spheres of influence, public diplomacy, and policymaking in these countries. The newspapers were part of the consulates' sources to pursue this mapping. So the Ottoman diplomatic missions carefully analyzed the foreign press and not only filed the reports containing information that directly related to the Ottoman military or political interest, but also actively worked on the image of the Ottoman government in the foreign public opinion, especially about the Armenian question. So one of the most striking works on foreign press was constant attempts of Mavriani Bey, the Ottoman ambassador in Washington, as Hazal Özdemir mentioned his name and his activities in her presentation. He regularly wrote to complain about the news and articles on the Armenian question in US, which were mostly written by American missionaries, or according to him, written under the influence of the American missionaries. So Mavriani Bey's diplomatic attempts on Armenian question and its representations paved the way to discuss the building of a security narrative in international relations. The approach of the Ottoman diplomatic missions on Armenian question actually was more proactive. This proactive tendency was one of the long-term effects of the pamphlet Bulgarian Horrors, referring to the institutionalized security memory. So the Ottoman diplomatic mission in London was also extremely active in collecting newspapers, articles, or interviews about the Ottoman Empire. Besides keeping abreast of current political events in the British Parliament, the diplomats of the Ottoman mission were also collecting information about local political gatherings and speeches about the Armenian question in different English cities. Balfour's or Lord Salisbury's speeches on Armenian question were closely analyzed with their views on Ottoman-Russian relations or the Britain's opposition in the inter-imperial relations considering the Eastern Mediterranean. So the Ottoman diplomats also contacted to people who could write positive articles or positive opinion pieces about the Ottoman Empire or about the Ottoman policies on Armenian question as part of the public diplomacy, and at the same time try to control the news about the Armenian question. So the influence of the American Board of Missionaries for Foreign Missions based in Boston on the production of the news about especially the Sassoon massacre in the United States became one of the most important issues for the Ottoman ambassador in Washington. The board's narrative on the Sassoon was mainly pointing out the Kurdish tribes, the attacks of the Kurdish tribes. The continuous attacks of the Kurdish tribes to the Armenian peasants in the region, and the actions of armed Fedai groups, the self-defense guerrilla Armenian guerrilla groups, as a counterforce in the region, with criticizing any kind of armed conflict. According to the board members, the intervention of the imperial government with the Fourth Army, the Army of the Eastern Provinces, and the Hamidian cavalries, which were consisted of the Kurdish tribes to Sassoon, with excessive use of force, resulted with a massacre, and the board invited the signatories of the Berlin Treaty to act with an international committee for the investigations of the Sassoon massacre. So Mavriani Bey wrote to the US government that this invitation for the foreign intervention to the Ottoman internal affairs was unacceptable, and mentioned that the board ignored the revolutionary activities of some certain Armenians in Sassoon. He also noted that not the American missionaries in the Ottoman Empire, but the board in Boston acted as an opposition towards the Ottoman government. So in addition to that, he also emphasized his awareness of the fact that the US government had no direct hold upon the board, but still wrote the Ottoman government's views on the actions of the board. So he also attached a newspaper article as a proof. In the same correspondence, he also answered the criticism towards Zeki Pasha, who was the commander of the Fourth Army, and defended his position. So in those correspondences, the Sassoon massacre was framed as an uprising, a rebellion by the Fedais, without mentioning the attacks of the certain Kurdish tribes to the Armenian peasants. In another correspondence, he put a copy of the resolutions which the Evangelical Alliance in Boston had adopted anonymously at a special meeting, and stated that this action was harming the prestige. Mavriani Bey stated that this action was harming the prestige of the Ottoman Empire. He emphasized that he wanted to point out the one-sided nature of this narrative, which was based on the Armenian newspapers or organizations and the accounts of the Armenian revolutionaries. And he was aware of the fact that the manifestation was tolerated by the laws of the US. But the main tendency of the diplomatic attempts of Mavriani Bey to the US government was, quote unquote, to show the moral influence of the Armenian revolutionaries on the actions or writings of the American religious bodies. That results with undermining the Ottoman government's power and prestige. So the press materials were also used to collect information about the revolutionary activities as well, their plans, the plans of the revolutionaries, their relations with different actors, etc. However, there was an overrepresentation of the revolutionary activities and repetitions of the same security narrative even reputations of the same documents or same journal articles. So I have a couple of examples, but I will just pass them. So the intelligence gathering on Armenian question involved the information gathering about the activities of revolutionaries, activities of other Armenian organizations in diasporas, lobby activities of certain Armenians, the relationships between the Armenian organizations and the foreign governments or, other foreign organizations. But those organizations, they were mostly the missionary or humanitarian aid organizations, and aiming at mapping the smuggling of guns from time to time and circulation of money on behalf of the Armenian revolutionaries and so on. So domestic intelligence reports were another significant pillar of the Ottoman security practices, which were mainly products of Ministry of Interior Affairs, Police Ministry, and the Fourth Army, the army in the eastern provinces. These reports were not only benefited by the domestic policy making, but utilized to establish a security discourse on the Armenian question in trans-imperial level. So a commission headed by Hüseyin Nazım Pasha, the police minister, prepared a booklet about the Armenian revolutionary organizations with the order of Sultan Abdülhamit II in February 1895. This booklet, which aims at strength, I'm finishing. So, which aims of the revolutionary organizations, their operations, their party programs, political decisions, support from foreign governments to their actions. And this booklet positioned the Ottoman Empire as a benevolent state that still recognized some privileges to the Armenian community, and gives the numbers, also, gives information about the criminal proceedings and so on and so forth. Those reports of Shakir Pasha, he was the General Inspectorate of the Eastern Provinces. Actually, he was appointed after the Sassoon massacre, and he worked during the Armenian massacres in the region. Reports of Zeki Pasha again, and these reports, actually, they were also constructing a denialist discourse or narrative of the events as well. So I'm using the interpretive denial also to understand those or to discuss those reports. So the roles of the victims and perpetrators were switched, with the latter now appearing defensive and actually suffering the most for having had to inflict such violence. And the second type, implicatory denial, the violence was framed as simple, the inevitable, and universal, as misery of war, and any significance or implications denied. So all those reports, actually, they were constructing this long-term denialism. And actually, it's like denialism in the making. Just, it didn't start with Sassoon massacre, but it was the turning point. And during the massacres of 94, 96, it continued, and it had also its effects while creating or producing the denialist discourse in the genocide as well. So thank you for your time and patience.
Thank you very much. You've put so many things out there for us to think about that I'm sure we'll get to in question time. Okay, so up next we have Umit. So Umit Kurt, Restraint of Mass Violence, the Microdynamics of Intercommunal Relations in Late Ottoman Adapazari on the Eve of the Balkan Wars. Umit is an historian at the University of Newcastle of the late Ottoman Empire, and he has a particular focus on the transformation of imperial structures and their role in constituting the republican regime. His research and teaching are grounded in theories of state and class, social identity, and ethnicity. He's the author of The Armenians in Aintab, The Economics of Genocide in an Ottoman Province, Antep, 1915, Genocide and Perpetrators, He's the co-author of The Spirit of the Laws, The Plunder of Wealth in the Armenian Genocide, and co-editor of Armenians and Kurds in the Late Ottoman Empire and the Committee of Union and Progress, Founders, Ideology and Structure. His research project, Global Patterns of Mass Violence, Ottoman Borderlands in Context, 1890 to 1920, was awarded with the Discovery Early Career Researcher Award. Take it away, Umid. Sorry, you'll just have to unmute.
Appreciate that. Thank you. So I'll do my best to keep my presentation as brief as possible. So I want to start with an anecdote, a story actually, a narrative, which I like as a historian. So at night on 25th of February, 1911, 3 Armenian and 2 Greek men who resided in the town of Adapazarı, located in the northwestern Turkey, connected to the province of Izmit in the late Ottoman Empire. They were caught having sex with a Bosniak Muslim prostitute in a bathhouse belonging to an Armenian. After being caught, they were brought into police custody. Later, the recently appointed local prefect of Adapazarı, Hüseyin Sırrıbey, ruled that the perpetrators should remain in custody until they could be brought in front of a judge. In doing this, he tried to give the incident a political character. If these people were to be released, he asserted, then problems might break out between Muslim and Christians of Adapazarı, just like what happened in Adana and its environs as the second series of large-scale massacres of Armenians that broke out in April 1909. The Adana events claim more than 20,000 Armenian lives. Citing his fear of similar violence, Sırrıbey applied to the district governor of Izmit and for the public prosecutor to issue an order for the perpetrators to remain in custody while the investigation continued. However, the prosecutor's office decided that, excuse me, I should shut the door. However, the prosecutor's office decided that this event was simply an immoral act of an adultery and therefore ordered the release of the persons involved. On March 1st, 1911, roughly a week after the incident in the bathhouse, 28 people, 10 of them headmen or neighborhood headmen, they signed a petition, joint petition, and delivered it to the local prefect's office, that is to Sırrıbey. According to the petition, a Bosniak migrant by the name of Hure, otherwise known as Zehra Hatun, lived in Çukur Ahmediye neighborhood of Adapazarı and had long been working as a prostitute. She had caused the physical and spiritual devastation of many young men. This is what they wrote and expressed in their petition. The Bosniak migrants in the town had been complaining the situation was unacceptable. They expressed their sensitivities by arguing, quote, "The reason we came here and abandoned our homeland in the Balkans was precisely because we could not consent to this sort of obscenity," unquote. The petition writers had already spoken with the authorities several times to ensure that Hure and her pimp faced legal consequences so that this regrettable immorality came to an end in their eyes. However, the necessary actions were not taken against these two individuals and they continued openly engaging in prostitution. In the most recent case, Hure was caught having sex with several non-Muslims inside the bathhouse of the Armenian community. They were caught and placed in custody pending trial. These immoral activities harmed the Muslim community, the petitioners argued. Therefore, they requested that Hure and her pimp Ankaralı be exiled to a distant place to show that the government would not permit such immoral acts. It would also be in the town's best interest to ensure that, quote unquote, prostitutes like this do not sour relations between the Muslim and the Christian communities who until this time had gotten along like brothers. Although the Muslim and non-Muslim communities agreed that the incident could be solved with the exiling of the perpetrators, local prefect Sırrıbey was not satisfied with this suggestion and took a different approach. he gave a man known as Lieutenant Hayrullah Efendi the task of visiting the coffee houses frequented by the Muslim community after the Friday prayers. Lieutenant Hayrullah's task was to tell them that Christians raped a Muslim woman, thus giving rise to rumors that would turn this incident into something like what happened between Christians and Muslims in Adana in 1909, like 2 years ago. On the local prefect's orders, the lieutenant tried to stir up the Muslim community by saying that not a single person had come to the Sırrı Bey's office to complain about this situation, this affront against Islam, even though he had expected them to come and deliver a joint petition. This apathy had kept him awake for 2 nights straight. Despite this attempted provocation by Hayrullah Efendi, the Muslim regulars at the coffee houses told him that they had complete faith in the judicial and administrative authorities to do whatever was necessary with the people involved in this incident. More importantly, they stressed that this affair was not something that would cause any conflict between the two communities. They told Lieutenant Hayrullah that they would be rejecting Sırrı Bey's request for them to write a petition. Notwithstanding this outright rejection he received from Muslim community, Sırrı Bey prepared a general petition that reflected his view of the incident. This he signed in the name of local assembly member Hacı Mehmet Efendi, and then Hayrullah Efendi took this petition around from shop to shop to have local Muslims sign it before sending it to the provincial authorities. Realizing what was happening, the Muslims from the coffee houses Hayrullah had visited immediately sprung into action. Responding to Sırrı Bey's act of forgery, many of the Adapazarı's Muslims, Armenian and Greek notables like doctors, local assembly members, headmen, Islamic preachers, religious figures, and Quran reciters, plus a group of merchants, both Armenian, Muslim, Greek, and Jews, they sent a complaint about Sırrı Bey to the presidency of the Ottoman Assembly on March 7, 1911. In the document, they stated that the local prefect's action should be investigated for putting the constitutional monarchy at risk and requested that an inspector be sent to Adapazarı. The petition accused Sırrı Bey of slander and calumny that would put the peace and order of Muslims and all the Christians of Adapazarı at risk. The group went even further and said that Sırrı Bey was playing a dangerous game by single-handedly trying to create an occasion for events like what happened in Adana to come between the Muslim and non-Muslim communities of the town. The same group also sent a telegraph of complaint to Minister of Interior. There, they wrote that they were ready to prove that Sırrı Bey was involved in other incidents that put the constitutional regime in peril. On March 13, 1911, the authorities decided to send a fair and unbiased civil inspector. On March 18, they handed over the petition to Deputy Inspector Sami Bey so he could shed light on the situation and discover the truth. After the inspector arrived in Adapazarı, he began collecting testimony from the people that wrote the petition complaining about Sırrı Bey. When the prostitution case broke out in Adapazarı, the internal politics of the Committee of Union and Progress, then the ruling Ottoman government, CUP, was rocked by serious infighting and factionalism within the committee's Thessaloniki, Macedonia, and Istanbul branches playing a central role. This ended up contributing to serious opposition to the CUP, with some circles criticizing it for constant interference in the matter of state. In 1911, opposition figures critical of the CUP's attitude united under the Freedom and Accord Party. That this case of prostitution occurred during such a political atmosphere helps us understand the late Ottoman Empire and the communal violence in a new way. Indeed, the absence of mass communal violence in the town of Adapazarı rested on a curious case of prostitution, allegedly to have occurred several years before World War I in the city baths. We understand both from the progression of the events and the inspectors' interviews that both the Muslims and Christians of the community wanted to preserve political and social peace. They defended constitutional ideals, even going against Sırrı Bey to do so. to the best of their ability, they tried to prevent the local prefect from destroying the prosperity of their town just so he could cover up his own mistakes and illegal activities. So how can we account for the success of restraint of violence in this case? What micro mechanisms did make it possible? How did individuals who wanted to restrain communal violence turn that goal into reality? Why does intercommunal violence happen in some situations but not in others? As historian Max Bergholz aptly underscores in his groundbreaking study on the Kul and Vakuf region in northwest Bosnia, answering this question can elucidate not only the under-researched dynamics of restraint, but also the widely debated mechanisms believed to drive the escalation of violence. Identifying and analyzing these factors will be valuable to scholars of genocide and political violence because they promise to tell us more about what elements must be absent and overcome for mass killing to happen. Scholarship about genocidal activity has been largely focused on explaining the origins, causes, and macro dynamics of large-scale, usually state-sponsored violence against Ottoman Christians. However, generally, this literature, including local studies, has not investigated microdynamics of restraint. Empirically rich and especially micro-oriented studies on this subject scarcely exist. So this work fills this lacuna, this gap, let's say. So analysis of this prostitution event offers us an important example of why mass violence like what happened in Adana seemed likely yet did not occur in Adapazarı. So it shows that because the social dynamics and network of relations in different provinces, different districts of the empire, Ottoman Empire, varied, the potential for realizing the Ottoman ideal, the citizenship, Osmanlı vatandaşlığı, Ottoman citizenship, differed according to space and time. Temporality and spatiality do matter here. What this microhistorical research sheds light on is that close to the imperial capital, in the critical period of 1911, on the eve of the Balkan Wars, the two dominant religious groups sought to live together peacefully under the banner of Ottomanism. Concomitantly, it reveals that the CUP, which had successfully organized a revolution for this ideal of coexistence in the July of 1908, continued to resist the emergence of any vacuum in political authority in the provinces. The first condition for peace between the different groups of empire and the prosperity, security, and order in the country was the continuation and sustainability of the constitutional monarchy. It was that Sırrı threatened with his actions. So it appears that Sırrı, an administrator representing the Ottoman government, used this prostitution case to distract from the accusations against him and the turn in public opinion. On the one side, there was a local prefect who saw relations between the two communities living together in fraternity and peace by creating an atmosphere of chaos and confusion. On the other side, there was a group of Muslim and non-Muslims trying to prevent this and preserve the constitutional order. With the petition they submitted, they were not only filing a complaint against the state bureaucrat, putting the regime in danger, in demanding state intervention to protect the constitutional order, they were also exhibiting a certain kind of political participation and representation. They were involved in a serious form of civil disobedience against the Sırrı-based illegal and utterly arbitrary actions that far exceed the authority given to him by the state. So let's try to focus on some of the interviews the inspector made with the local people in the city. So basically, they told the inspector that Sırrı attempted to politicize this matter by writing in his petition that unless these wrongdoers were punished, a mobilization or stir would have occurred among Muslims, and this would have culminated in a regrettable incident. For signatories of the petition, Sırrı meant Adana events by a regrettable incident. For them, by not stating the fact that Hure was already a prostitute in his petition, Sırrı showed his bad intention. Yet there was no agitation or effervescence among Muslim community against Christians in the town because of such a prostitute. This is what exactly they say. They wrote in their petition. To them, Sırrı wanted to show the situation the other way around. For instance, Seyfettin Efendi, one of the signatories of the joint complaint letter about Sırrı, explained the inspector that they even had good terms with Christians in the era of Abdülhamid autocracy of Atapazarı so far. Despite that, District Governor Sırrı tried to break off this atmosphere by spreading a rumor that Christians were violating a Muslim woman, and if they were not put in prison, another incident would happen in Adapazarı. According to 28 signatories, Sırrı acted like that in order to secure his position, his officialdom. Therefore, they also informed inspector of Sırrı's other deeds, which were opposed to the constitutional regime and put it in danger in the eyes of these people. They told inspector, although he knew that it was against the law, Sırrı took money from the field taxman and forest contractor to take care of their problems or fulfilling their work with the local government. Moreover, they claim that Sırrı did harm to state treasury by delaying an important bit about a big forest as he wanted to sell this forest to a foreigner. As a state official, he committed numerous arbitrary actions at the expense of so many people's interests. Lieutenant Hayrullah Efendi was dispatched to Muslim coffee houses by Sırrı and told people here, quote, Christians were bringing Muslim women to bathhouses. Is your blood dry? Unquote. In response to Hayrullah's reaction, Muslims retorted, there was a government here, and let it resolve this problem and punish wrongdoers. Then Hayrullah said, quote, I was sent by the government and it waited for your application. District governor didn't eat and sleep because of this incident, unquote. Again, in his telegraph dispatched to Izmir district governorship, Sırrı wrote that, quote, a Muslim woman was forcefully violated by 2 Greeks and 3 Armenians in an Armenian bathhouse, unquote. He wrote a Muslim woman rather than a Muslim prostitute. For them, a district governor who was supposed to be supportive of constitutional monarchy or regime must not have behaved like that. He exaggerated an ordinary adultery incident and used it in order to awaken feeling of hatred amongst Muslims against Christians in the town and wanted a deplorable incident would happen like in Adana in April 1908. All his actions were against constitutional regime according to the signatories of the joint complaint letter. These people, 28 people, also let inspector know the fact that these guys who were in unlawful relationship with this prostitute were set free by the court and walk among the people without having any problem. No one knows was even blood. For them, there was no tension or conflict between Muslims and Christians of Adapazarı that would have led to what happened in Adana. So this adultery incident gives us important insights to understand political and social environment of the late Ottoman Empire, both in general and in the periphery, immediately before the war in Tripoli and the Balkan Wars in 1912 and 1913. It shows us that there were 2 ethno-religiously different communities living in rather close to the empire's capital, as I have pointed out, who wanted to live under the rule of Ottomanism in such a critical period. Continuity and sustainability of the constitutional regime were hinged on establishing law and order and unity among Ottoman elements in the empire. District Governor Sırrı's activities and deeds constitute a great hurdle to this ideal. Apparently, as a local officer representing government in Istanbul, he used this adultery incident to fend off claims of Adapazarı public about him. By submitting their petition to the Ministry of Interior, both Muslim and non-Muslim communities of Adapazarı show a kind of political participation in terms of complaining about the state officer who endangered the constitutionalism, meşrutiyet, and demanding necessary actions to be taken for the sake of preserving constitutional order. What Sırrı Bey was trying to do was also unacceptable for the government, CUP government under the Grand Vizier of Ibrahim Hakkı Pasha. It was the last thing the CUP government wanted. Events or massacres, just like happened in Adana in 1909, would have broken out in Adapazarı, which was very close to the capital of the empire. These kinds of events would damage CUP's own legitimacy and political power in the first place. Because April 1909 Armenian massacres in Adana and its outskirts dealt a huge blow to the CUP's idea of bringing various elements of the empire together under the rubric of Ottoman citizenship or Ottoman identity, regardless of language, religion, and ethnicity. But this adultery incident and following developments, reactions of Muslim and Christian inhabitants in Adapazarı exemplified the restraint and impossibility of violence, unlike what happened in Adana. In this sense, it's better to keep in mind that potential fruition of ideal of Ottomanism or Osmanlılık varies from region to region, location to location, because the social dynamics and networks of relation in provinces, districts, and towns of the Ottoman Empire were different. Additionally, administrative attitudes and dispositions of Ottoman bureaucrats play a key role in this, and in this aspect was embodied in the case of Sırrı Bey. One significant reason why an intra-ethnic strife did not break out between Muslim and non-Muslim residents of Adapazarı, where religious and ethnic diversity did exist in such a critical period, was the fact that Lieutenant Hayrullah Efendi's, Sırrı Bey's men, attempts to spread the rumor Christian men were forcefully having sex with a Muslim woman in an Armenian bathhouse. That was not well received and believed by Muslim and non-Muslim communities. It's fairly an important tool for perpetrators in the events of collective violence to build up and construct an atmosphere of fear by emerging and diffusing manipulative rumor, thereby exacerbating the tension among different communities and making it sustainable. The underlying objective for the creation of such an atmosphere is to motivate and encourage one community to act violently against another one. At the local level, civil and military bureaucrats as well as provincial elites create a climate of collective panic and wild paranoia, which constitute both an ideological and functional ground for the possibility of outbreak of violence. Looking from this perspective, District Governor Sırrı Bey had an agenda of creating a climate of ethno-religious violence by spreading the rumor of Christians violated a Muslim movement, and this incident would give rise to a regrettable event between two communities. Besides, he acted upon his own personal motivations, but his attempts failed. Both Muslims and non-Muslims of Adapazarı did not give credit to those rumors and Sırrı Bey's provocations through Hayrullah Efendi. They put their faith on the government to solve this problem by sending Hure away from the town and taking necessary actions to punish culprits in this adultery incident. They said to Hayrullah Efendi outright, candidly, that they trusted law and order in this country. So then why did Sırrı Bey behave like this? Why did he try to provoke Muslims? Why did he distort their initial petition? Why didn't he state the fact that Hure was a Muslim prostitute? Inventing that kind of calumniation about Adapazarı people might have emanated from his personal grudge, as he got in trouble because of his illegal operations regarding the bit of this big forest, Süleyman Forest, and 28 signatories mention it in their joint petition. District governor also menaced poor villagers, frightened and intimidated them. For instance, according to one Armenian signatory, Hagop Daylaryan Efendi, he said, Sırrı Bey acted like a dictator, committed arbitrary treatments for him and other signatories who were mostly prominent elites of Adapazarı, such as Hamit Bey, Ömer Efendi, even calling the name of Adana massacres and reminding of it by depicting it as a deplorable event was dangerous and intentional. So, to conclude, moderation became the upper hand between the two communities for restraining and avoiding violence in such a critical time period, and the idea of living together constitute a common ground in this case. Dividing the society around an ethno-religious perception, which was manufactured as Muslims and Christians, was not allowed by Adapazarı people per se. See, the CHP government in Istanbul also did not let that kind of division happen. Establish neighborhood relationships, which created strong bonds between Muslims and Christians, face-to-face interactions in the walks of economy and trade. And these sorts of specific social and political dynamics hint at presence of a social capital that led to restraint of local violence in Adapazarı. It's safe to say that Adana was short of these dynamics in 1909. Unfortunately, the major actor of this adultery incident in the town, Hure, also known as Zehra Hatun, she was entirely disregarded as an individual and a woman over the course of all the story. Her chastity and pudicity were utterly described on the basis of her body. The whole Adapazarı society, including these 28 signatories, never happened to consider why she was earning her life by quote-unquote selling her body, for she was viewed as the cause of defiling Muslims' honor and ruining moral, money and body of Muslims and Christians youngster. As a prostitute Hure, she did not have any right of living in their eyes. As Zehra, her name was only mentioned once amongst the bulk of documents I found in the archives. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Umit. Okay, so we'll move on to the lucky last presentation of the day. Hans Lucas with A Mental Map for Violence, Dr. Riesener's Writings on Armenians and Jews. So Hans Lucas Kisa is a historian of the late Ottoman Empire, Turkey, and the post-Ottoman Middle East at the University of Newcastle, Australia. He's the author of Nearest East, American Millennialism in the Middle East, Talat Pasha, Father of Modern Turkey and Architect of Genocide, and When Democracy Died, The Middle East's Enduring Peace of Lausanne.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to Sasha and Umit for organizing this symposium. I have the chance and honor to have the last word, except in the discussion. Normalizing violence would probably be a better title to my paper, I think now. The political author Reza Noor, the main character of this paper, made violence against Armenians and Jews a norm, a normality, even a triviality, as according to what he considered to be laws of nature and history. So my paper has a lot to do with ideology, but we will see how closely it's also related with implementation. Political scientists consider Noor the main link between late Ottoman and post-Ottoman Islamic pan-Turkism or Turanism. Turanism is the ideology of a superior Turanian race and of its early historical greatness to be restored, to be brought to a quasi eschatological modern climax. In the ruling circles of contemporary Turkey, Noor enjoys an excellent reception after decades of Kemalist disdain. Noor had been a co-founder of the Ankara government in 1920 and several times a minister. He negotiated Ankara's treaty with Moscow in 1921 and was the deputy head of the Turkish delegation to the Lausanne Conference in 1922-23 alongside İsmet İnönü. These years on the cusp from the Ottoman to the post-Ottoman era were the high point of Reza Noor's political career. He was a leading figure in the large cohort of hardliners. 5 years younger than Talat Pasha. He was 2 years older than Atatürk and Enver Pasha, and 5 years older than Ismet İnönü, und thus the senior in Lausanne, both by age and diplomatic experience. Unique in Noor's case is not the striking need of most young Turks to write and justify or ego-narrate themselves. Unique is the feverish degree and continuity of such writing activity and the emphasis on history in Noor's text. Besides historical narratives, his writings offers us particularly frank insights into the cohort of Republican Turkey's founders. With him, many radical aspects emerge unfiltered, including a few disarmingly open passages on personal weaknesses that hardly fit into his overall social Darwinist approach. Now in the first 10-15 minutes, I'll make, or I continue to make an oral presentation on Noor and his writings, particularly on Ermeni Tarihi, that's a manuscript on Armenian history, an eye-opening, repulsing read that emphasizes the racial, biological, cultural, and political inferiority of Armenians and Jews. According to the author, Noor, of Ermeni Tarihi, Jews and Armenians deserve persecution, massacre, and calamity throughout history because of racial defects, lack of military virtues, and notorious treachery. Dozens of pages of the 508 pages manuscript of Ermeni Tarihi apply this rationale to the Armenians in 1915. Since the 1934, Ermeni Tarihi is deposited in Berlin's Preußische Staatsbibliothek and has hitherto never been studied. It is in Ottoman language and in handwritten Ottoman script. At a special panel at the Orientalistentag last year in Berlin, we started to work on it. And now we envisage a critical edition in Turkish, and this in addition to separate analysis of unpublished other works by Noor, such as novels, an opera, and poetry. The opera, by the way, is on Osman Topal, or Topal Osman, who is probably the most prominent, efficient, and cruel entrepreneur of violence in this transit between late Ottoman and post-Ottoman era. If Sebastian judges at the end that there is still a bit time, I will show a few illustrative slides with additional insights at the end. A few words first on our general topic, mass violence in the late and post-Ottoman lands. What are main and distinctive features? Let me briefly set the context for what I'll say on Noor. I pick up on some points I covered a few years ago in my chapter in Phillips and Joy Damussi's Cambridge History, World History of Violence, Volume 4. I have insisted there on patterns of internal societal violence. Of course, we could also insist on patterns of peace and constitutional patterns, but fortunately, this is exactly what UMIT has done. So I have labeled one pattern of violence, prominent especially in the late Ottoman core region, Anatolia, Syria, Mesopotamia. I've called it or labeled it domestic jihad, that is societal mass violence by Sunnis, the nominally ruling group of the Sultanate Caliphate. 2 centuries ago, revolutions in the Atlantic world coincided with an escalating crisis in the still largely pre-modern Ottoman Empire. local and global dimensions entangled as never before during the French invasion of Egypt and parts of Greater Syria at the end of the 1790s. International stakes entered Cairo, where French aggression and repression of resistance went hand in hand with urban mob violence against those locals identified with foreign power. Copts and other Christians, later the Rum, that is the Greek Orthodox Ottomans, and the Armenians, were considered Oriental limbs of a global body of adverse Western Christianity, which was growingly perceived as a threatening superpower. Public violence against them became built into the fabric of late Ottoman society, and even more so with the start of national liberation movements in the more Ottoman Balkans. So there we can, of course, distinguish then the category of the border violence, and I focus much more now on the internal violence that has little to do with the borders. Ottoman Christians were suspected to have broken a contract of submission and loyalty, what justified violence against them. Violence often targeted neighbors, even friends considered traitors. This applies also to the large-scale pogroms against Armenians. They have been mentioned, 100,000 dead in the 1890s. It applies partly also to the CUP genocides, although in the case of the Armenian genocide, decisive agency came from the central state. International power relations changed, but social religious hierarchies went on during the late Ottoman period in the mind of the members of the ruling religion, even if the elites were less confessing than cultural Sunnis. But the political thought of westernized educated elites, including Zanur, evolved in important ways. Categories of race, biology, and Darwinism, together with the new notion of Turkish nationalism, started to inform their thought. Nur graduated at the Military Medical Academy in Istanbul in 1903. He became a surgeon and soon a professor of surgery before entering the Ottoman Parliament as its youngest member after the Young Turk Revolution. He had joined the CUP, the Young Turk Committee of Union and Progress, at the Military Medical Academy, where the committee had been founded 20 years earlier. This, in short, was Nur's general background and socialization before the Ottoman cataclysm took place, that is, the cataclysmic decade preceding the Lausanne Conference, where the empire was eventually liquidated. Nur was thus a representative of a westernized late Ottoman education elite, and finally of the imperial cohort that founded the Ankara-based nation-state exactly 100 years ago. Within a spectrum of late Ottoman, early post-Ottoman, Sunni Turkish nationalism, he represented the widespread hawkish version. CUP single-party rule and extreme internal violence had radicalized the political sphere and had destroyed almost any residual hope on a more plural and democratic common Ottoman future during the 1910s. So no coincidence that the example presented by Ümit happened in 1911. That is just when the turn towards the radical cataclysm was beginning, but not yet, the CUP was not yet fully taken by it. When a constructive common Ottoman horizon vanished, Nur's cohort conceived of the future as a radical Darwinistic struggle. This targeted Ottoman non-Turks and non-Muslims in Asia Minor at the first place, people who did not fit into the new notion of a unitary Turkish Muslim nation in a Turkish homeland, Anatolia. From 1914, Anatolia was cleansed from Christians, but was then still the core of an empire. After 1918, it was claimed as the land of a unitary nation state. This struggle to get rid of native non-Turks and competitors and their claims is the defining context of Reza Noor's historical writings. We see this both in his affirmative Türk Tarihi on the history of the Turks, and even more sharply in his rejectionist Ermeni Tarihi. Right at the beginning of Ermeni Tarihi, Noor summarizes the manuscript with the following keywords: ancient and modern Armenian history, Armenian states, Armenian nation, Armenian homeland, the Armenian cause, Turks in Armenia, Armenianness versus Turkishness and Muslimness. Can Armenia be viable and live? Judgment. The last question, viable future, and the last term, judgment, are decisive. Here is Noor's plain final judgment on Armenian future and self-determination. I quote, "It is against nature that the Christian people, which is a minority only, lives in Asia Minor and the Caucasus. Such a people is like an alien body in Asia. For the Armenians, there is no solution except to bow to the unavoidable heavy consequences of this unnatural state, or to convert to Islam, or to disappear." Noor's text, therefore, is about coming to the, well, pre-existing judgment that all non-Turks in Asia Minor, particularly the Armenians, were invaders since the antiquity, unlike Turanians, the righteous, autochthonous race, as in Noor's fiction. These peoples came to us from other countries and remained as foreign bodies in the Turkish race. According to Noor, the Armenians had migrated from northern Greece to ancient Anatolia and had absorbed in one a Jewish tribe expelled from Palestine. For Noor, Armenians were like Jews, a small, rootless people of bad character who were at the wrong place wherever they lived. They are, I quote, "restless like the Jews. Both people are obstreperous and of evil character. This invites disaster upon them. Thus they were always crushed and massacred." In this and similar ways, Noor's Ermeni Tarihi whitewashed violence throughout history against Armenians and Jews, the peoples he despised most. With Turks, he associated grandeur and heroism. With Armenians and Jews, smallness and suffering, for what he had only contempt. After defeat in the World War and the start of the peace negotiations in Paris, the cohort of Turkish nation-state founders claimed victimhood for themselves. They turned against the victors who prepared the Paris-Geneva peace. Geneva must be included because of the League of Nations, whose covenant heads all those Paris peace treaties. Noor's cohort accused the diplomats in Paris of, I quote now Noor's friend Safed Atabinen, of annihilating the Turkish nation. Atabinen labeled them imperialists, Turkophobes, Islamophobes. Most of this cohort denied, belittled, or even openly ridiculed the crimes of the COP regime against minorities in their pamphlets, many of them, by the way, printed in Switzerland. Atabinen was a particularly productive pamphleteer, so a friend of Noor. He became the general secretary of Ankara's delegation in Lausanne, where the COP crimes were the elephant in the room. They were no longer addressed for fear of upsetting Turkey. The incisive date is the 6th of January 1923, when Noor furiously quit a meeting on the Armenians in accordance with his instructions from Ankara. He led the delegation in Lausanne's Commission for Minorities. Because Nur had fallen out with the CUP in the early 1910s, he was an ideal representative of the early Ankara government, including in Lausanne. His presence helped disguise the real continuity between the CUP and CUP's war regime and the new government. Still, there were several close collaborators of Talat Pasha in Ankara's delegation, and many more in the Ankara government and administration. During World War, Nur had enjoyed paid medical training in Switzerland and Egypt. In this semi-exile, he identified with Talat's exterminatory Armenian policy, and he used documents produced in Talat's Ministry of the Interior for his Ermeni Tarihi that he had begun circa 1914. He finalized this manuscript during the Lausanne Conference, assisted by a secretary of his delegation. He noted with satisfaction that this conference eliminated the Armenians diplomatically after they had nearly been wiped out physically. Nur's thoughts were manifestly not the mental spawn of a socially marginal scribbler, but that of an influential spokesman. I have made extensive use of Ermeni Tarihi in my study of the Lausanne Conference. Unlike his later memoirs, which are his best-known work, Ermeni Tarihi is much more authentic. It directly reflects the mindset of Nur and his cohort in the early 1920s. During the Lausanne Conference interval, hot discussions took place in the National Assembly in Ankara, and Nur had to give an account on his work, especially on minorities, because, as I said, he headed the delegation in the Committee on Minorities. On 2nd March 1923, he had to defend himself in the National Assembly against deputies who wanted the total removal of non-Muslims from Anatolia. They wanted them all exchanged, as went the euphemism. Nur tried to calm down the protesters regarding the Armenians. He said that anyway, only a few were left. Regarding Jews, he stated, they have not created special problems. They are people who go where one moves them. But of course, I'd prefer they would not exist. His contempt for Jews went hand in hand with their use by Ankara in Lausanne especially, but also otherwise, as a showcase. They served to prove that minorities who behaved well were not harmed. And those harmed must blame themselves. This is how Ismet's and Nur's argument went at the negotiating table in Lausanne, and one can read this in the minutes. During the 8 months of the Lausanne Conference, Nur enjoyed good press in the countries of the formal Central Powers. As a rude critic of the Paris-Geneva peace, he impressed European revisionists. They took to heart not only the pioneering Turkish example of revision and Western appeasement, as it resulted from Lausanne, but also Ankara's radically nationalist policies before and after. Among those impressed was Carl Schmitt, later a prominent Nazi lawyer. He took Lausanne-born Turkey as a role model for what he called, I quote, the reckless nationalization of a whole country. For him, New Turkey, as he called it, was an exemplary, homogenized and leader-led mass democracy. Many other anti-democrats were perverting the notion of democracy in those years, of course. Nur himself insisted in Lausanne that Turkey was a true and secular democracy after the Sultanate had been abolished at the eve of the conference. In the mid-1920s, Nur broke with the Kemalists and fled into exile. He disapproved of their abolition of the caliphate, their compromises with Western powers, and their one-man rule. Shortly before, however, in 1924, the Ministry of Education in Ankara had published the first 12 volumes of his Türk Tarihi, his History of the Turks. This publication was meant to serve national education, as reads the introduction. To be sure, the sharply anti-Armenian and anti-Jewish passages of Ermeni Tarihi do not figure in this official publication. But Ermeni Tarihi too had been intended as a means for national education, as reads its introduction. Türk Tarihi is post-Ottoman Turkey's first public version of an educative national history thesis before Atatürk's notorious one in the 1930s. Although both approaches overlap in crucial aspects, the later version dismisses the Turanian terminology, while it insists on the Aryan identity of the Proto-Turks who allegedly belonged to the, listen well, species of the Homo alpinus. In this vision of history, the Armenians have entirely disappeared, and that's a main goal of the effort. In a recent new article, I have insisted on the nexus between grandiose history construction and the suppression of accountability for and the memory of mass violence. Like Nur, Atatürk insisted on Turkish autochthony in Anatolia and the argument that the removal of the non-Turks restored what was rightful in the light of pre-ancient history. In contrast to Nur, he did no longer explicitly long for pan-Turkic unity in the future. But he maintained Nur's vision of a superior Turkish race, superior at least in the sense that it had pioneered civilization and state building from China to Europe, and even that Turkish was the original language of humankind. Nur's Türk Tarihi drafted a national history of salvation and divided time into three major epochs: the pre-Islamic, the Islamic, and the present. History would culminate in a modern Turanian Islamic synthesis that would eventually produce a greater Turkey based on race and Islamic religion. This Turanist scheme of national salvation is familiar to all those who deal with this area and era from the writings of Ziya Gökalp, the acknowledged spiritual father of Turkish nationalism, a close friend of Talat Pasha. The sacred, I quote, idea of uniting all Turkish tribes in the homeland of Turan under one flag, as reads the introduction of Türk Tarihi, so the official publication, is in line, of course, with Gökalp's vision of such a Turkish federation. Atatürk's racial history thesis, on the other hand, rejected Islam altogether. Islam is a pillar for Nur and, of course, for Gökalp, at least until 1922. In the last decade of his life, Atatürk sought evidence through physical anthropology and craniometry alone in Anatolia. Hence, Atatürk's friendship with Eugène Pitard, a Genevan anthropologist, and a doctoral thesis by Atatürk's adopted daughter Affet İnan, who claimed the Turkish origin of, or at least kinship with, the Homo alpinus. Now, if I have still 2 or 3 minutes, I would add a few slides, but the chair decides.
Why don't we treat that as the first question, essentially. I might give you the opportunity to present those slides because I'm sure we're all curious to see what they are. But first, I'd just like to thank all of the wonderful presenters in this panel. You've delved into some fascinating topics in incredible depth. And yeah, I won't hold us any longer. Let's go for it, Lucas. So would you like to share your screen there and show us the...
You give me 2 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I look here, share screen, yeah. Does it work?
Yes.
It works. So, okay. Now, just take this here. So, yeah. It's illustrative. Now here you see Rezanur here in Moscow, 1921, together with the then foreign minister Yusuf Kemal Tengershek, and vis-à-vis them is Georgi Chicherin, Bolshevik foreign minister. That was for the Treaty of Friendship with Moscow, and that we can compare it to the treaty with Stalin in 1930, as Germany, Hitler-Stalin 39, in the sense that they then decided to divide Poland, a bastard of the Versailles Treaty, as they said, and here they also divided Armenia, a weak creature of the League of Nations, as they say. And here is a celebration then in 2011 of this treaty. And here again, you see Rezanur. Yeah. Okay, I go on. He was proud of what he did in Lausanne, and even he exaggerated his own role. So you see him here at the side of Ismet Inönü, the #1 plenipotentiary. He was the vice plenipotentiary. But he has then nevertheless criticized and become the main reference for all what became Lausanne revisionism. And now Lausanne revisionism is now at the highest point it ever was with the current government. So, Ermeni Tarihi, just a few quotations. So, the Treaty of Lausanne has buried the Armenian question. The Armenians, had remained like a malign tumor in our body and needed to be removed by a surgical operation. We are Turanians, we are the pure, unmixed, and as he said at other place, autochthonous population of Anatolia. The other, of course, do not own any right. And this I had already quoted. And here, full of then comparisons with the Jews, even if politically and diplomatically, he played the game of Jews as a wonderful model minority. A list of the sources that he gives, just as much as I had place on this slide. It's written in Latin script by himself. He is very keen to show as much as Western sources as possible, as if he thought that only Western sources were reliable. But of course, he mixes this then also with, this is the famous Talat Pasha book, or produced in his ministry, about this denial of the Armenian genocide, the number 16. And this is the frontispiece of Ermeni Tarihi. So it's in Berlin since 34. And the map of Great Turan he places in his Türk Tarihi is yeah, but one could say a lot of things, but that's not so important. The only thing is to see once on a map how they imagined Turan. And of course, there are quite a number of elements that could speak for a notion of Turan. The problem is how they then exaggerated and went into fiction with what, of course, is a widespread picture of Turkic speaking peoples. That's a reality. So this very comparable picture pops then up from Atatürk's history thesis of the 1930s and is used until the end of the 20th century. Yeah. Only there is not the explicit then vision or dream of a Turkic unity in the future, so that would encompass this whole space under a Turkish federation, as according to Gökalp. Yeah, and that's the last one. He lived and died for Turkdom, his grave. Thank you for your attention.
Fantastic. Okay, now the floor is open. Any questions? Umit?
I'm just applauding.
Okay. Yes, Sasha?
Sorry, just working out the sound here. Thank you for absolutely fascinating papers. I was really struck by the extent to which Reza Noor is borrowing language and, in a sense, rhetorical techniques from the West or from sort of international context in order to legitimize his position. And I'm very taken with the idea of grandiose history writing. But if I can try and sort of go from there to the sort of broader papers we've heard, and with this using this idea of borrowing from the West as a notion. When I was listening to Hazal's paper, and I was particularly struck by the echoes I was hearing to the work of, for example, Jennifer Aluzzi, who's looked at Italian nationalists, the Italian national state's attempt to police the Romani population, or also Matthew Fitzpatrick's work on the German state, the Kaiserreich's attempt to police undesirables in inverted commas. I'm most familiar with what is written there on the Roma, but those efforts to police them, and particularly because of the German context and that relationship between Germany and the Ottoman Empire, I'm wondering, is there evidence of the Ottoman Empire actively borrowing techniques from Germany or from other European states? Or is it just a case of, this is the modern bureaucratic information state, and this is what the modern, this is what the state does? It occurs to me that I might pose the same question to Ilke as well, because there's of these techniques of surveillance, whether they're actively borrowing ideas from from other states in their approach. So that was a very long-winded question. I'm terribly sorry for that.
Thank you for this question. I can start. I didn't come across something specific of Germany, and I think we can see the relations with Germany may be more prominent during the period after I'm studying. But what I recognized was the encounter with Russia and bureaucratic and legal tools. For example, the Russian law on nationality and denaturalization came in 1868, a year before the Ottoman law of nationality. And very similarly, Russia had really strict denaturalization rules. And also, Russia came up with a similar rule of denaturalization to Jews and Crimean Tatars who were living elsewhere, like the Ottoman Empire or the US in 1892. The Russian government said that you can go, but you're not allowed to come back, and you have to renounce your Russian subjecthood. But interestingly, today I didn't talk about it, but another requirement for Armenian migrants to deliver 2 photographs to the state to be blacklisted. And a similar photography requirement was not present in the Russian case. So I think that the government of Abdülhamit II might have learned this tool from a Russian government and extended with adding photography requirements because it was kind of an obsession for the Sultan.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. In terms of surveillance, actually, they were closely looking at the regulations about criminal procedures, both in Germany, back then Prussia maybe, and also France, mainly France. And they were using, or at least like they were trying to understand those regulations, especially about vagrants and vagrancy laws and internal travel passes. Interestingly, they were also looking at what was happening in Great Britain, but also US and Canada, especially in the means of mobility of the vagrants. So, yeah. And yeah, I mean, Hazal already answered the other similarities. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Hans Lucas.
I just wanted to address shortly Ilkay with her paper, which I found very interesting in how you show this concentration and also synergy that is built up within the late Ottoman state because of the Armenian question. So all these aspects that you listed, all these different instances and offices also, from the army to the Wali to then also the embassies and of course the central government. But you only very short, as you just said, instead of taking seriously the real issue, security of the Armenians. That is what you said in a sentence. Now, I would be interested to know more about this. Were they also afraid about a vision, let's say a democratic vision? Do they, for example, is the notion democracy pops it up in these reports? Did they feel challenged by a democratic constitutional vision for which, of course, the Armenians, there were many groups, but all in all, they stood for, so they represented these wishes. And so I would a little bit also be interested, not only, so now not only, let's say, in this defense, which is important and interesting, so wonderful project, but also what they feared with regard to positive and constructive notions of projecting and building a new future.
Thank you very much for the question. Actually, it's a very complicated problem. So in this presentation, I mostly focused on the high-level bureaucracy and their reports. But when you look at the local bureaucracy, like sub-governors in the region, you can actually find different kinds of reports. So there are also quote-unquote like progressive or maybe like more Democrat governors in the region or sub-governors, but mostly their reports or their ideas were easily dismissed, especially with the reports of the Zeki Pasha, the head of the Fourth Army. He was even very powerful in the means of, changing or replacing the governors with his quote-unquote intelligence reports. And this idea of democratic representation, actually it was part of the, of course, it was part of the long-term Ottoman modernization, especially, when you look at the ideas of the Mithat Pasha. But of course, there was this break with the after the Ottoman-Russian War. But the problem about democratic representation, although it was framed in the Vilayet Nizamnamesi, the regulation of the administrative units, especially in the regulation of the townships, the nahiyes, the nahiye Nizamnamesi. Actually, in those small local administrative units, there should have been the representation of the non-Muslims according to the population rates, population numbers. And it was also an issue in the report of the Reform Commission, or, also in the memorandum of the Great Powers after the Sassoon massacre, this representation in the local administrative units. The answer from the Ottoman government actually was the minoritization of the Armenians in the region. So they changed the internal borders of these small townships. Even if in one township, the Armenian population, the Armenians could be majority of the population, they just, tried to shift the borders and try to make the Armenians as quote unquote the minorities. So it's, it harmed the idea of political representation in the very first step. So yeah, there were always, I can say there were always like opposition in the means of this intelligence reports. But when you look at the higher levels of bureaucracy, the government, then, then you could easily track this quote unquote one tendency of creating a security narrative, which criminalizes the whole Armenian population. So, yeah. And it's also interesting to ask the question, why those people in the bureaucracy, those people with a tendency of democratization, or, opening the public sphere or opening the political sphere, the channels of political policy making, why they would be so easily dismissed during this process. So.
Very short only. Thanks very much. The word democracy as such, so not translated into synonym. Does it pop up in certain reports also?
No, I didn't see it. It was mostly about the temsil, so representation. And very rarely they were using this term in the diplomatic correspondence with US and Washington and London. So it was something quote unquote foreign. Or for example, for France, I remember one intelligence report, it was saying that even in a democratic country like France, so they were saying it like Fransa gibi demokrasinin olduğu bir ülkede dahi. So, but as far as I remember, it didn't pop up to discuss these matters in the internal Ottoman political sphere.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So we're running a bit behind, so I'll try not to keep everyone forever. I do have a short question that honestly I'm sure any of you would be able to answer. My research tends to come from the Bulgarian side of the border, and throughout looking at Bulgarian security documents over the decades. A policy of exclusively referring to Turks by words other than Turks sort of emerged. So they're referred to as saboteurs, traitors, idiots. You're not allowed to use the word Turk, essentially. And I just wonder if any kind of equivalent appears in Turkish writing, sort of the other way towards the minorities.
Yeah, I'll try to answer. Yes, the very interesting lexicon actually and repertoire you might want to see, especially immediately aftermath of the Balkan Wars, you know, and after this great disaster, we could see the rise of ethnic nationalism in the late Ottoman context. And there were the year before, there were some activities to establish certain clubs and associations, not only in Istanbul, in the imperial capital, but these associations were mushroomed across Anatolia, and they were basically called Turkish homeland clubs, Turkish homeland associations, Turkish power, Türk Gücü associations, and these were basically the founding fathers of these associations. They came from the Balkans. They were known as Evladı Fatihan, so Turkish Junkerdom, you know. So they were weaved, and as they fled to the empire as a result of the Balkan disaster, and they were full of rage and more nationalist, all this stuff, you know, you can imagine. So they start founding these kind of associations and articulating, exerting, and also forming the main contours and the foundational elements of modern Turkish and early Turkish nationalism. And one of the main components of this nationalism was it was so reactionary. And these reactionary forms of nationalism, in some occasions, articulate itself in almost a racist tone, and by denigrating and depicting, also humiliating, the non-Muslim elements of the empire. The Greeks, Serbians, Bulgarians. Bulgarians were usually depicted as pigs, you know, and also çorbacı. Like, I don't know how to translate this into Turkish. It means çorbacı means who's a big fan of soup, whatever. Okay. And so they were also denigrated or portrayed as microbes, you know, and the vermins as well in these magazines, journals, by very highly intellectual Turkish authors. But most of them were the Balkan immigrants, I would say.
Okay, fascinating. Sasha, you've got something to add?
I was hoping to ask a question, if I may, of Lucas, and a question of Umit. Lucas, I asked earlier a question about borrowing from Europe, but of course Europe was also borrowing from Turkish nationalism as well, and there's all this interesting work on the German interest in the Young Turks. I was wondering though, when looking at this fabulous map you have of this amazing Turanian homeland, I was wondering whether these kinds of maps were ever in dialogue with, for example, the Hungarian imaginings of themselves as Turanian, or the Finns had this image later on of Greater Finland as this enormous territory stretching out across the north of Russia, and again at various times have been racially imagined as kin to the Turks, and whether there was any interaction there. And Umit, a really interesting paper, and I've never felt more unknowledgeable about a place before. So I'm wondering, because there seems to be, on one hand, what seems to be happening here is a politician who has very little credibility, has chosen a not very persuasive example and tried to trigger a scandal about us, and failed. But on the other hand, you know, you make a really good point that in this town, there's not the existing tensions that you find in other places. There's a social capital that holds things together. So much of the work on the Armenian genocide highlights things like the desire for land or the desire for property as driving it. Were these not factors that were at play in Adapazari? Sorry, I probably horribly mispronounced that name.
Okay. First, second. But Ümit, if you prefer, you can just answer. It's fresh in your mind, perhaps now. Go on.
Okay, thank you. So regarding your first question, should I answer the first question as well, or I'm
second, which is turned to
second?
you.
Okay, second one. Yeah, thank you so much. It's a really good point. The issues you have just raised became more vocal and visible on the eve of war. Yeah, because actually the most what strikes my attention in this particular case is that, you know, in a not very small town, but it was a district close to imperial capital Istanbul. We are talking about two ethno-religiously diverse societies, communities trying to keep the constitutional monarchy or constitutional regime in order vis-a-vis the proponent, vis-a-vis the officer of this exactly the same regime. But aftermath of the Second Balkan Wars, especially, you know, I look at the prison records of the same town, the number of criminals, the type of crimes, and everything. After December 1912, the number of crimes just skyrocketed in the town. It's really strange, and also the most of the crimes were murderous activities, and they were committed against Christians, and these murderous activities were represented in the newspapers, local newspapers of the town back then, like rather than giving the name of the criminal was depicted as Armenian, Greek, Jew. As you see, the violence produces this ethnic divergences, as Laura Robson has beautifully pointed out in his book, The Political Violence in the Modern Middle East. So we see the same kind of pattern as Max Berkholz also describes that as subject nationhood, how it was created. And that's and when you come to the period of deportation and genocide, because there were really vivid Armenian community in Adapazarı, and all of them was deported. And we are talking about like the 1,100 Armenians in August 1915, for instance. They were deported. Even the worst deportation area in Syria, Deir Zor. All these Armenians. So you see, within 3-4 years, the whole political dynamics and the constellation changed drastically. Of course, at the disadvantage of the non-Muslim or the Christians of the town. So, but my point is, I just zoom in on this particular time period to see the possibility or likelihood of the restraint of violence. But after 2 years, the dynamics, you know, became or show the other way around.
Thank you. That's fascinating.
Thank you.
Very shortly, there was also a Pan-Turanian movement current in Hungary, and Reshid Safet Atabinen, whom I mentioned, went also there. So he was a little bit the international ambassador these kind of historical theses, also then of the official of Atatürk's history thesis. He could go to the Sorbonne and give talks on this subject. So he was also he went also to Hungary and gave talks and was in touch with them, but I do not know. So you may research on that. I think you know Hungarian. Okay. Anyway, there was
sadly not.
I do not know, and there was, let's say, a certain extent a collaboration. It was, of course, not so serious. With Finland, I do not know if I never heard about the Banturanist current, but of course, the central question for us here is what link to violence. You can have grandiose ideas, etc. No problem. The question, as far as this does not or has not a strong link to violent politics, that is the case in Noor's case, who is, as I said, who wrote an opera for Topal Osman, who is one really of the worst genocidaires. Even Kemalists would absolutely accept, in his case, the worst titles. So here you see that you have extreme ideology and have you extreme violence, and you see that it is in a synergy. That is, one strengthens the other. So that's the, let's say, unique is too much, but that is the very striking feature of Noor's thought, who was a weak person finally, if one reads his memoirs. So it's a little bit like Nazis who were weak characters. But let's say a bit disarming aspect of Noor is that he writes down at least a few passages with his weaknesses. I would say that saves, even if these are sometimes very bad things, but it saves a bit his humanity, because it shows he has, there is a problem, he sees it, he tries to formulate it and has not necessarily an answer. So yeah, it's just we are historians, we want to give justice to the topics and also the figures we are talking about. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Ilkay?
Thank you. I also wonder if Rıza Nur had any personal connections with Nihalatsız, another famous Turanist. And another question, again, about his writings, especially about the Armenian history. Are there any gender aspects in his writings? Thank you.
Perhaps Ümit knows more details, but I'm pretty sure he has quite a close connection with Nihalatsız. I'm not even sure if there was sort of like an adoptive relation, kind of, but I've forgotten a bit. It is too long that I read about this. The gender aspect. The gender aspect is very present in his memoir, so there one can say quite a lot of things. Now, I think if one would explore it with this focus, one would find, but now let's say directly for me, I have once read the whole text and then picked what I needed for my Lausanne study, so I will revisit for the for the edition that I mentioned shortly. Of course, the text. So were not so striking gender aspects. There, I guess, if I look closer, that there are, because sometimes he has very biological reasonings in his Armenitarichi. But in my memory, it's not first gender. It's more this racial depreciation that he makes based on biological arguments. Yeah, the hairs, for example, that the body of Armenians. So
circumcision. He was obsessed with circumcision too.
He also had a book about circumcision procedures as a medic.
Yeah. By the way, Rıza Nur and Nihal Atsız had very intimate relations, because Rıza Nur accepted him as his adopted son. Yeah, manevi babası. So
Okay.
you can figure.
Fascinating. Okay, I might have to end the discussion here. It's getting quite late. I just wonder if anyone has any final comments, or maybe final give final thanks to our great organizer, Sasha, for putting this all together for us.
I can't take all the credit. This has very much been a cooperative exercise with Umit, and I would like to thank everyone for participating in this. It's been really, really fascinating, and it's it's been wonderful to hear these papers and to this discussion.